Have you ever been the one who always gave, until you realized it was never enough? What if the love you gave was mistaken for an obligation? This is the story of a mother who finally decided to stop giving, and what happened next might just shock you. Stay tuned to find out how setting one simple boundary changed everything. Oh no. I must have left my wallet at home. Daniel's voice rang out, just a little too cheerful, as he glanced around at the table. The laughter that followed was immediate, as if the words themselves were some kind of inside joke that only he and Lauren shared. It was a moment that should have been lighthearted, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the joke itself, it was the way it landed. That familiar, calculated grin of his and Lauren, who barely even glanced up from her phone, just pretending to fumble through her purse. We were seated at a crowded steakhouse, the kind with dark wood walls that seemed to absorb the noise around us. The amber lighting was soft, almost comforting, creating an illusion of warmth in a room full of people, all eating, drinking, laughing. It was meant to be a celebration of Daniel's recent promotion. A moment to be proud of him, to feel like he was moving up in the world. And I was proud, of course. But at the same time there was a tightening in my chest, something I couldn't quite explain. Daniel had insisted we all order what we wanted. "You've earned it," he said with that easy confidence, as if it were all a foregone conclusion. So we did. We ordered the most expensive things on the menu: filet mignon, lobster tails, a bottle of wine that cost more than I had spent in a month. I watched them indulge, the children giggling as sparklers danced on top of their desserts, and I smiled, proud, quietly. But beneath the surface of that smile, something was changing inside me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that it didn't sting when I looked at the bill and saw the total, $842.16. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just a celebratory dinner. It was a pattern. A pattern I had seen before, and yet I had always made excuses for. The forgotten wallets. The empty apologies. The unspoken assumption that I, as always, would step in and cover the cost. As the waiter stood there, holding the leather folder, waiting for me to pull out my card, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was expectation. This was something they had come to count on without even realizing it. And it was wearing me thin. Lauren's laugh cut through my thoughts as she slid her phone back into her purse, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing over a lipstick. "That's so weird," she said in her usual light tone. "I could have sworn I put my card in here." It was the same performance, the same rehearsed act. I could almost hear the scripted words before they left her lips. It was a show, but one I had been playing my part in for far too long. And in that moment, as they all laughed, it dawned on me just how much I had allowed myself to be part of it. I slid my card out, signing the receipt without a word. The waiter thanked me softly, and I could feel his eyes on me as he walked away. I didn't even feel anger, not really. I didn't even feel embarrassed, though there was something cold creeping over me. Something more unsettling than any of those emotions. It was the awareness, the realization that I had allowed this to continue for far too long. Lauren took a picture of the table, as if nothing had happened, as if I weren't just silently picking up the pieces of a pattern that had been repeated too many times. "Family night," she said, snapping the photo with her usual cheerfulness. And there it was, the illusion of normalcy, of family, of love, all of it shattering around me in the quiet, unspoken understanding that had always existed between us. But I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't just the one who picked up the tab. Not anymore. Hey there, welcome to Empathetic Story. I'm so glad you've joined me today. This story might sound familiar. Maybe you've been in a situation like this before, where you felt the weight of expectations creeping into your relationships. If so, I think you'll really resonate with what I'm about to share. So sit back and let's dive in together. I didn't know how it had gotten to this point. How had it become so normal? For me to cover their mistakes, their forgetfulness, their irresponsibility? Was I really just supposed to keep giving? And for what? It was more than just the money. It was the principle, the subtle erosion of respect that had snuck in unnoticed. I had told myself for years that this was just what mothers do. That it was my role to be there, to be generous, to provide. But there came a time when the giving wasn't out of love anymore. It was out of obligation. And that's when it started to hurt. I had spent years telling myself that their reliance on me was just a temporary thing. That they needed me, that I was helping them. But deep down I knew it wasn't true anymore. They didn't need me in the way I thought they did. They needed me because it was convenient. They needed me because I had allowed it. And in that moment, sitting there with that expensive bill in front of me, I realized something. Generosity requires gratitude. And they hadn't shown me that. Now, before we dive deeper into this journey, if you're feeling moved by what you've heard so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps me continue sharing these kinds of heartfelt stories, and it encourages me to keep creating more content that resonates with you. Asterisk asterisk. This was the moment, the tipping point where everything started to change. I knew I couldn't keep allowing this dynamic to continue, but I didn't know yet how I was going to change it. What I did know was that I had to take control back. And I would. But how? Feel free to continue watching as we explore how Margaret slowly but surely started to shift the power dynamics in her family, and how, in doing so, she restored respect and dignity. After that night at the steakhouse, something shifted inside me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The feeling that I was living in a pattern, a cycle of expectations and obligations I had allowed to form without realizing how much it had cost me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the silent way they had come to rely on me, and the way I had allowed it to happen year after year. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. The usual phone calls asking for help, the casual texts about this or that financial need, those things stopped. I didn't know whether it was because they were aware of the distance I had put between us, or if they simply didn't expect me to respond anymore. Either way, the silence was deafening. I wasn't sure if it felt like relief or dread. All I knew was that something had changed. The silence was broken one morning when I walked into Mr. Henderson's office. The air was different today, though. Crisp. Not the usual hum of routine. I had been here many times before. This quiet office building, the soft click of the door as I entered, the gentle scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. But this time, I wasn't here just to review numbers or talk about investments. I wasn't here just to make sure everything was still running smoothly. No, today I was here because something deep inside me had shifted. Today I was here to take back control. Mr. Henderson greeted me with his usual calm, steady handshake, the kind that always felt reassuring, almost like a silent promise that everything would be okay. But today I wasn't sure it would be. As he asked how I'd been, I simply nodded. The truth was, I wasn't the same person who had walked into his office before. I wasn't sure who I was, but I knew this. I was no longer going to let my family's needs define me. I wasn't going to let them define what I could give and how much I could endure. I was done with being a placeholder in their lives, a wallet with legs, an endless supply of support and generosity with no gratitude in return. We sat at the polished conference table. I watched him pull up my accounts on the computer screen: retirement savings, certificates of deposit, the modest trust that Thomas had set up for Daniel when he was born. The figures were neat and organized, and yet they felt like little more than numbers. Cold. Impersonal. I listened to Mr. Henderson explain growth rates, maturity dates, and projections for the future. He spoke as if he were discussing someone else's life, as if it didn't matter that these numbers had been built over a lifetime of hard work, sacrifice, and care. When he finished, I found myself asking a question I had never asked before. I wasn't sure what had made me ask it, but it felt like the right time. I asked what would happen if I chose to restructure the trust. If I had the authority to change the terms, adjust the distribution timeline, or even redirect a portion to charitable causes. It was the first time I had truly felt in control of my own life, my own financial future. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and I saw the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He explained that as the sole living grantor, I had the right to make any changes I saw fit. I could adjust the terms, add conditions, perhaps even postpone Daniel's access to the trust until he was older, until he was in his 60s instead of 50. I could do all of this and the numbers would still be there, still growing, still protected. It wasn't about taking away. It was about choosing where my money went, choosing who got what and when. I could feel the weight of the decision settling over me as I listened to him type in the changes. As he turned the screen toward me, I saw the numbers had not changed, but something else had. The control had. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about regaining the balance I had lost, the power I had given away without realizing it. As I left the office that day, the crisp autumn air felt sharper, colder somehow. I could see the way the leaves trembled on the branches, and I realized for the first time in a long time that I was no longer just a participant in my own life. I was the one who decided what happened next. I didn't have to play a role anymore. And I didn't have to give just because they expected it. I could choose. I could say no. And that, in itself, was freeing. I drove home slowly that afternoon, the world moving on outside my window, but inside I was calm, steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was simply aware. Aware of what I had allowed, and more importantly, aware of what I had the power to change. I didn't know exactly how my family would react. But I knew this. The pattern had to stop. The first real test came soon after. Daniel called, his voice filled with that familiar urgency. He spoke quickly, listing all the things they needed. Interest rates were changing, the opportunity for a larger house was now or never, and of course they needed help with the down payment. I could hear the rehearsed lines, the pleading behind the words. But I didn't react. I didn't immediately say yes like I always had before. Instead, I listened quietly, letting him finish. When he finally paused, I didn't jump in with the usual offer of help. Instead, I said the words I had been holding back for months. I've reviewed my finances and I won't be contributing to the house. Not this time. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence felt thick, heavier than I expected. Then Daniel's voice, thin but controlled, responded, I understand. It wasn't a relief. It wasn't a victory. It was just truth. The truth of a relationship that had been built on imbalance. And now the beginning of something new. And I knew in that moment that the shift had begun. The silence after that conversation with Daniel was deeper than I had anticipated. It lingered between us like an unspoken truth, hanging heavily in the air. I didn't know what to expect next, whether he would resent me, or whether he would simply continue on with his life as he always had. But I knew one thing for sure. My decision had marked a turning point. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, independence, and the boundaries I had finally set. The next morning, I found myself driving to Mr. Henderson's office again, this time with a different sense of purpose. The light outside was softer than usual, the early autumn sun filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. I wasn't going to talk about the numbers today. I had already made those adjustments. No, today I was here for something else entirely, something I had been putting off for far too long. It was time to take a closer look at my family's financial future, and by extension my own. It was time to take control. Mr. Henderson greeted me as usual, with that steady handshake that always gave me a sense of calm. As we sat down, he started going over the details of the trust one had restructured. I was no longer the passive participant I had been in the past. Now I was the one making the decisions. He pulled up the numbers on his screen, showing me the adjustments I had made. How I had postponed Daniel's access to the trust until he reached a later age. How I had added contingencies for financial independence. For the first time, I wasn't just reviewing figures. I was seeing the power that came with those numbers. I was seeing how those numbers could shape the future, not just of my family but of my life. And it felt empowering. As he spoke, I felt a quiet surge of clarity. All these years I had let them take and take without truly questioning. And now here I was making choices that would impact their future, not from a place of obligation but from a place of strength. I wasn't taking anything away. I was simply choosing where my resources went. Choosing to protect myself, my future, and yes, even my son's future, but only when it was right. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. I knew Daniel would not understand immediately. He had been raised in a world where the safety net was always there, where financial help was just a phone call away. But now I had taken that safety net away, at least for a while. And I didn't feel guilty. For the first time, I felt in control of my own choices. Mr. Henderson finished up his explanation and looked at me, waiting for my next move. But I didn't need to say anything. The truth was, I had already made my decision. I was done being a backup plan. I was done being someone's emergency fund. The control I had taken in this moment wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper. About reclaiming my life from a pattern that had been established long before I even realized it. As I left the office that day, the weight on my shoulders seemed to lift just a little. The sky was clearer, the sun a bit brighter, and for the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe without the constant pressure of others' expectations hanging over me. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I had shifted something within myself. And in doing so, I had taken the first step toward breaking the cycle that had kept me bound to a role I never really wanted to play. When I got home, the phone rang. It was Daniel. He didn't waste time. "Mom, I was thinking about the house and the down payment," he started, his voice still laced with that familiar urgency. "We've got an opportunity, and it's a good one, but the bank needs more than we thought for the down payment. Could you?" I let him finish, but my answer was already forming in my mind. I wasn't going to say yes, not this time. Not anymore. "Daniel, I've reviewed my finances," I said, my voice steady, calm. "And I'm not able to help with the down payment. I won't be making any large contributions moving forward." There was a long silence on the other end, longer than I had expected. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I understand," he said. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just acceptance. Maybe he had expected this, or maybe he was just learning to accept it. I could hear the shift in his tone, a subtle acknowledgement that something had changed between us. But it wasn't a relief. Not for me anyway. It was just a sign that the boundary I had put in place was starting to have an effect. And that was enough. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about him agreeing with me. It was about the fact that I had finally spoken my truth. I had finally made a choice for myself, without worrying about disappointing anyone. And that, I realized, was a gift I had never given myself before. The world outside hadn't changed, but inside I felt different. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, without the weight of their expectations holding me down. The days after I made that phone call to Daniel were quieter than I expected. No frantic calls asking for help with this or that. No casual requests for a quick loan. No pleading for assistance. It was almost as if the air between us had changed, the space between us suddenly a little too wide to cross. I didn't know if he was processing the conversation, or if he was simply trying to figure out how to react to the shift I had made. Either way, I knew something had changed. But even with the silence, I still wasn't sure what that change meant. It wasn't until the fundraiser invitation came that I realized just how much had shifted. Not just between us, but within me. The invitation was simple, almost too simple. It was a flyer, attached to a text message from Lauren, inviting me to the school fundraiser. The cost for the sponsorship table was listed at the bottom, as it always was, along with a list of other ways to contribute. This time, though, there was no mention of me being expected to pick up the bill for the entire table. The pressure wasn't there, and neither was the assumption that I would cover it. I sat with the message for a while, staring at it. Part of me wanted to immediately say yes, to just go along with what had always been expected of me. But I didn't. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I took a step back, considering not just the cost of the sponsorship, but the emotional cost of being the one who always stepped in. For once, I wasn't going to let that guilt push me into another decision. I wasn't going to say yes just because it was easier, just because it was what I had always done. I decided not to sponsor the event. I didn't even need to explain it to them or to anyone. All I had to do was be honest with myself. I would attend, but I would attend as a guest, not as the one who bailed them out yet again. It wasn't about being cruel, it wasn't about punishing anyone. It was simply about setting the boundary that I needed. When I finally responded to Lauren's text, I kept it simple. I told her I would be attending the fundraiser, but I wouldn't be purchasing a sponsorship table. I didn't go into detail. I didn't have to. The fact that I wasn't automatically offering to pay, that I wasn't bending to their unspoken expectations, said everything. The night of the fundraiser came, and I found myself driving to the venue with a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the usual rush of anxiety I would get when I knew I was going into a situation where I was expected to give, expected to be the one to foot the bill. No, tonight I was simply going to enjoy the event. No financial obligations hanging over my head. No silent expectations waiting to be fulfilled. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the difference. The room was filled with familiar faces, parents chatting with each other, children running around. But there was a subtle shift in the air. One that I could feel but couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the absence of the financial burden, it was the absence of the pressure I had always felt to perform. To be the one who provided. Daniel and Lauren were there, of course. They had a table set up with friends and family. As I walked in, they greeted me warmly, though the smile on their faces was slightly strained. I could see the glances they exchanged when they realized I hadn't sponsored the table. They hadn't said anything out loud, but I could feel the shift. The question was in their eyes. The same question that had lingered in the background for years. Why isn't she just giving? I didn't let it bother me. I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't going to justify my choice to them, or to anyone else. I was there to enjoy the night, to support my granddaughter, to see the kids perform, not to be the one who always had to carry the weight of their expectations. As the night went on, I noticed little things. Daniel was more relaxed, more present. He wasn't distracted by his phone, wasn't busy trying to juggle all the financial details of the evening. Lauren, too, seemed a little more at ease. She didn't ask me for anything, didn't try to make me feel like I was failing as a mother or grandmother. There was no undercurrent of expectation, no sense that I was supposed to be the one to pick up the slack. At one point, my granddaughter came up to me with her usual bright smile. She tugged on my sleeve and asked if I would be coming to her dance recital next month. I looked down at her and smiled, a genuine smile this time. "Of course, sweetie," I said, feeling a warmth in my chest that wasn't about obligation or duty. It was just love. Pure, simple, and free from expectation. Later, Daniel came over to me, a cup of coffee in hand. He sat down beside me, his posture more open than it had been in a long time. There was no mention of money, no request for help. He simply sat there for a moment, watching the kids run around before he spoke. "I noticed you didn't sponsor the table this year," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I simply nodded. "I support the kids in ways that feel right to me," I said, keeping my voice calm. Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering my words. Finally, he nodded. "I get it," he said, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: recognition. Acknowledgement. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. I didn't need to hear him apologize. I didn't need him to express gratitude in any grand way. What mattered was that he understood, even if just for a moment, that love isn't about what you give. It's about why you give. It's about the respect that should come with that love. The night ended quietly, and as I drove home, I reflected on the shift I had seen in him, in Lauren, and in myself. There was no dramatic confrontation, no grand revelation, but there was a quiet shift, a recognition of boundaries, of self-respect, and of the importance of giving, not out of obligation but out of love. I hadn't needed to make a big speech, hadn't needed to explain why I had chosen to set this boundary. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. And in that moment I knew that I had given them something far more valuable than money. I had given them the chance to stand on their own. And in doing so, I had given myself the peace I had been searching for. The days following the fundraiser were filled with a quiet stillness, almost as if the world was holding its breath. There were no more phone calls filled with veiled requests for financial help, no sudden urgent needs, no desperate pleas wrapped in polite tones. I thought it might have been temporary, a brief pause where they processed the shift in dynamics, or maybe they were simply waiting to see how long this new me would last. Whatever it was, I couldn't deny that the change I had longed for felt real. But as the days stretched on, I began to realize that change wasn't just about me setting boundaries. It was about them, about how they were going to respond to the absence of what they had always known. It was just a few days after the fundraiser when I got the message from Daniel. The tone was almost casual at first, the way he had always been. Focused, determined, always with something on his mind. But this time the words felt different. There was no sense of urgency, no pressure to act quickly. He mentioned that they were reconsidering the house purchase and would probably wait another year. He acknowledged the need to pay down some of their existing debt first, a sensible decision, and one I hadn't expected him to make so soon. It was almost as if he had heard me, even though I hadn't said much at all. I didn't respond immediately. I needed a moment to reflect, to understand the gravity of what was unfolding. In the past, I would have jumped at the chance to provide reassurance or to tell him it was okay, to ease his concerns by offering a helping hand. But now it felt different. There was something in his message that didn't demand a solution from me. Instead, it was more like a statement of growth. And for the first time in a long time I realized he might actually be figuring it out on his own. He was starting to see the bigger picture, and it wasn't just about getting what he wanted right away. The shift I had been waiting for seemed to be happening. Slowly but steadily, Daniel was stepping into a space where he understood the value of financial independence and responsibility. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it wasn't the end of the road. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that he was growing in ways that didn't rely on me bailing him out. That message was the first sign that the pattern was truly starting to break. When I saw Lauren later that week, she was different too. Her smile was still there, but it was warmer, not forced. She asked how I was doing. But there was no hint of pretense, no underlying expectation of financial support. We spoke about the kids and the upcoming holidays. I didn't have to worry about whether she was asking for something, whether she was hoping I'd step in. It was a normal conversation between family members, and for the first time it felt real. I began to realize something profound in these small moments. The absence of financial dependency wasn't creating distance between us. It was allowing for a different kind of closeness, one built on mutual respect and understanding. I had worried that by setting boundaries, I would push them away or make them feel unloved, but the truth was the opposite. They were starting to see me as more than a provider, and in turn I was seeing them as more than just recipients of my generosity. We were all starting to step into our roles with a sense of equality. As the holidays approached, I was struck by how much had changed. There was no talk of extravagant gifts or big celebrations. This year it was going to be simple, just a quiet Christmas dinner at my house. Daniel called a few days before, asking if I wanted to host. There was no mention of presents, no request for financial help. He offered to bring the main course, and Lauren volunteered to bring a couple of side dishes. There was a gentleness in the way he asked, a quiet understanding that had been missing in the past. It was as if he was saying, "We can do this on our own, but we'd love for you to be part of it." On Christmas Eve, the house smelled of rosemary and cinnamon as I prepared the dinner, a sense of calm settling over me as I set the table. The familiar dishes were laid out. Nothing fancy, just simple, warm comfort food. As I arranged everything, I thought about the years before, when these moments had been overshadowed by guilt and expectation. But this year there was none of that. There was only peace. When Daniel and Lauren arrived, they brought the turkey and a few side dishes. The kids ran around excitedly, and the conversation flowed easily. We talked about the weather, the kids' school projects, and the usual holiday happenings. There was no talk of money, no mention of future expenses. It was as if the financial tension that had once hung in the air had finally dissipated. I watched as Daniel helped clear the dishes without being asked, and I realized how much he had changed. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a small but significant sign that he was learning to take responsibility, not just for his finances, but for his role in our family. Lauren too had shifted. She thanked me for the cranberry sauce without prompting, and later asked for the recipe, not to compete, but to learn. It was a simple request, but it was meaningful. It wasn't about keeping up appearances. It was about connecting. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Daniel pulled me aside. He said he had been thinking about everything I had said, about how generosity should come from a place of love, not obligation. He admitted that he had taken my support for granted, and for the first time, I saw in his eyes an understanding that hadn't been there before. He wasn't asking for more. He was simply acknowledging the shift. As they left later that evening, I stood at the door watching them drive off. There was no dramatic finality to this moment. There was no grand gesture. But there was something more important, a quiet recognition of how far we had come. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of something new. Something that was rooted in mutual respect, in boundaries that didn't tear us apart, but brought us closer together. I closed the door and walked back into the kitchen, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. The envelope with the check they had given me sat untouched on the counter. I didn't need it to feel validated. I didn't need it to know that I had done the right thing. The real gift this year wasn't in the material things we gave each other. It was in the love, the respect, and the understanding that had finally begun to flow freely between us. And in that moment I knew that this was what real family was about. It wasn't about giving everything you had. It was about giving what was meaningful, and knowing that the love would always be enough. As the months passed, it became clear that something had shifted, not just in me, but in Daniel and Lauren too. What had once felt like an insurmountable divide was slowly beginning to close, but it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a quiet, steady change, small gestures, unspoken acknowledgments, and the gradual removal of expectations that had once hung over us all like a thick fog. I didn't need any grand gestures to feel the shift. I felt it in the way Daniel had asked to host Christmas dinner this year, in the way he didn't hesitate to bring the turkey himself. There was no hidden agenda, no implication that he expected anything from me. There was a simple understanding that, for once, he wasn't relying on me to make everything happen. That in itself was a victory. The pressure to always be the one who provided, the one who held everything together, had dissipated. We were finally operating as a family again, not as a giver and receiver but as equals. Christmas morning was crisp, the kind of cold that made the air feel fresh and clean. And as I walked around my kitchen preparing the meal, I couldn't help but reflect on how different this year felt. The house was filled with familiar sounds, the kids giggling as they opened gifts, the soft hum of the radio in the background. It was the same as every other year, and yet it wasn't. There was a sense of calm this time, a quiet sense of balance that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't about the presents or the food or the traditions, it was about something deeper. When they arrived, Daniel and Lauren came in with the usual holiday cheer, but there was something in the way they moved, the way they interacted, that felt less performative. They didn't have to impress me anymore. There was no underlying expectation that I would swoop in to fix everything. No hidden agenda lurking behind every smile. We simply enjoyed each other's company, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was playing a role. I didn't feel like I was trying to be something I wasn't, someone who could fix everything. I was simply me. The dinner itself was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was perfect. Daniel and Lauren had cooked together, and the children were excited to share their drawings and stories. As we sat down to eat, there was an ease to the conversation, a lightness in the air that had been absent for so long. It wasn't forced, it wasn't strained. It was just real. After dinner, Daniel offered to help clear the plates without being asked. It was such a small action, but for me it carried so much weight. It wasn't just about cleaning up after dinner. It was about responsibility, about taking ownership of his actions, about not relying on me to carry the load anymore. The truth was, I had always done everything. I had always been the one to step in, to take care of things, to make sure everyone had what they needed. But now it was different. Daniel was starting to shoulder his own responsibilities, not just for himself but for the family. And in that moment I knew that I had done the right thing by setting those boundaries. He was learning to stand on his own, and he was doing it in his own time. Later that evening, as we sat around the tree, the children unwrapping gifts and the soft glow of lights reflecting in the windows, I realized something profound. It wasn't about the material things. It wasn't about the presents or the decorations. It was about the quiet moments, the simple ones that held the most meaning. The way Daniel didn't hesitate to ask about the turkey recipe. The way Lauren complimented my cranberry sauce and asked for the recipe. Those small acts of consideration were the true gifts of the season. They weren't trying to win my approval, they were simply being with me. And that, more than anything else, meant more to me than any gesture could. As the night came to a close, I found myself standing at the door, watching them leave. Daniel hugged me in a way that felt different. No longer the hurried, perfunctory hug of years past, but one that carried a depth of understanding. He thanked me for the meal and for everything, but there was no need for thanks. I had done what I had done because I loved them, and that love wasn't transactional. Never should have been. As I closed the door behind them, I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the quiet that had settled over the house. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of meaning. It was the kind of peace that comes when you no longer feel the need to prove yourself, to justify your actions, to be anything other than who you truly are. I had spent so many years living under the weight of expectations, mine and theirs, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without the constant need to give. That night I sat in the living room, the lights from the Christmas tree twinkling softly in the background. I didn't feel the need to analyze everything that had happened. I didn't need to measure the success of my actions or worry about whether they understood the lesson I was trying to teach. I had done what I needed to do. I had set the boundaries that were necessary for my own well-being, and in doing so, I had given my family the space to grow. The next morning the kids came running into the kitchen, excited for the day's plans. There was no tension, no expectation. There was just love. And in that moment, I knew that I had done more than just set boundaries. I had helped create a space where love could exist freely, without the weight of obligation. And that was the greatest gift I could give. As winter settled in, the changes that had begun to unfold within my family became clearer with each passing day. The delicate balance that had once seemed impossible to achieve now felt within reach, like a quiet peace slowly taking root. For years I had carried the weight of expectations, both my own and theirs, and had allowed myself to believe that love meant always giving, always being the one to make things right. But now the dynamic was different. It was more than just the absence of financial dependency. It was about creating a relationship where respect and understanding replaced obligation, where love could thrive without strings attached. The truth was, setting boundaries had been harder than I had anticipated. I had always believed that by stepping in to help, I was showing my love. But what I had failed to recognize was that love, when given with strings attached, when given from a place of expectation, can lose its purity. It becomes a transaction rather than a gift. That realization had been painful but also liberating. For the first time I wasn't afraid to say no when I needed to, and I wasn't afraid of the silence that followed. I had learned that silence in this case wasn't a sign of rejection. It was a sign of growth. The turning point had come during the Christmas dinner. A small, simple gathering that felt different from all the others. Daniel and Lauren had truly stepped into their own this time, not because I had forced them to, but because they were beginning to realize that their actions had consequences, that they were capable of standing on their own. And in doing so, they had given me a gift too, the gift of peace. The holidays were always a time for reflection, but this year, it felt more meaningful. The house was filled with laughter, not because anyone was trying to make up for something, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. There were no long pauses filled with unspoken expectations, no subtle guilt trips hanging in the air. Just a shared appreciation for the simplicity of being together. It was a new kind of comfort, one that didn't require anyone to give more than they could afford, either emotionally or financially. As I sat back and watched the children play, I realized how much I had missed these moments. Moments where we simply existed together, without the weight of financial transactions, without the pressure of constantly providing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of the family in a way that was genuine. I wasn't just the bank. I wasn't just the person who bailed them out when things got tough. I was a mother, a grandmother, and a person in my own right. I had rediscovered my place in their lives, not as a provider, but as someone who could simply be present. And that was enough. Later that evening, Daniel pulled me aside, his voice soft but steady. He said something that I hadn't expected. "Mom," he started. "I've been thinking about everything about what you said. I've been taking a lot for granted. And I'm sorry." The apology wasn't dramatic or overly emotional, but it was real. It was the kind of apology that came from someone who was starting to understand what it meant to stand on his own 2 feet, to take responsibility for his own life. It wasn't about money or the things I had done for him. It was about him recognizing that love doesn't always come with a price tag. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to repay me for everything I had done. The truth was, I didn't want repayment. What I wanted was a relationship based on respect, on mutual understanding. And that, in that moment, was what I got. I didn't feel the need to explain myself, to justify my actions. I simply nodded and said, "I know, Daniel. I know." As the evening wound down, I found myself feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The quiet that filled the house wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a peaceful kind of silence, the kind that comes when you finally let go of the things that no longer serve you. I had set boundaries, yes, but those boundaries had allowed space for love to grow in a new way, a way that didn't require constant sacrifice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally standing in my own worth. The next few weeks were filled with small shifts. Daniel continued to show up in ways that felt more responsible. He made more decisions on his own, not out of necessity, but because he was beginning to understand that he could. Lauren, too, seemed to be adjusting to the new dynamic. There were no more subtle requests for financial help, no more hints or assumptions. There was just an awareness that had been lacking before, a recognition that we were all capable of contributing in our own ways. I didn't need them to acknowledge my boundaries constantly. I didn't need them to thank me or to praise me for the changes I had made. The real change was happening in the way we interacted, in the way we were learning to respect each other's space, each other's needs. The real change was in the way we were finally learning that love is not about who gives the most, but about who is willing to stand on their own and, at the same time, give space for the others to do the same. As spring approached and the days grew longer, I felt lighter. The air was fresh, the days filled with possibility. And for the first time in years I was looking forward to what the future held. Not with fear or guilt, but with hope. Hope that this new understanding, this new balance would continue to grow. That, in the end, the love I had always wanted for my family, love that was real, unconditional, and free from the weight of obligation, was finally becoming the foundation we could all build on. And so, as I stood in my yard one morning, watching the first signs of new life emerge from the soil, I realized that this wasn't just about boundaries anymore. It was about freedom. Freedom for me and freedom for them. A freedom to love without expectation, to give without obligation, and to receive with gratitude. That, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give to my family. This journey of setting boundaries in family dynamics highlights the profound shift that occurs when we stop allowing ourselves to be defined solely by what we give. For years, Margaret had silently borne the weight of her family's expectations, believing that generosity and love meant always stepping in, always providing. However, she eventually realized that true love is not transactional. It's about respect, mutual understanding, and the freedom to give from a place of balance, not obligation. By setting boundaries, Margaret wasn't closing herself off to her family. She was giving them the opportunity to grow, to stand on their own, and to recognize the value of their actions. This shift in her approach didn't just free her. It also allowed her family to evolve into more self-sufficient, responsible individuals. The lesson here is that setting boundaries isn't about shutting people out. It's about ensuring that love and respect can flourish in healthy, meaningful ways. In our own lives, this story teaches us the importance of recognizing our worth and understanding that love is most impactful when it's free from expectations. We often find ourselves caught in patterns of giving without regard for our own needs. But by setting clear, compassionate boundaries, we allow ourselves and those around us to grow in a more authentic and respectful way. It's a powerful reminder that true love and respect go hand in hand, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is say no, in order to preserve our sense of self. Question for you: how have you set boundaries in your own family or relationships? And what changes have you noticed as a result? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Empathetic Story to stay tuned for more heartfelt content that explores the power of boundaries, love, and self-discovery. Your support helps me continue creating stories that resonate with you.